or almost 8 years, from 16 June 1937 to 29 April 1945, I served as Luftwaffe adjutant attached to the Adjutant der Wehrmacht beim Führer und Reichskanzler and experienced the rise and fall of National Socialist Germany in the closest proximity to Hitler. Describing my reminiscences has been an extraordinarily difficult task. My diaries were destroyed at the end of the war. Some of them I placed in the fire myself. Hitler's naval adjutant Puttkamer was responsible for burning those at Obersalzberg. And as Allied troops advanced towards my in-laws' estate, my wife destroyed the remaining documents I kept there. During my captivity, I made notes which form the foundation to this memoir. My wife and brother have assisted me. I have attempted to remain uninfluenced by other witnesses and the flood of inaccurate literature concerning those times. In particular, I am thinking about the fantasies surrounding the last few weeks in the bunker. I am not a member of that choir which now condemns vociferously what once they so admired, and who always knew at the time, or sometimes even before it, exactly how things were bound to turn out for the worst. I was a career airman and looked to the future. More than once I attempted to return to squadron duty, but Hitler would not let me go. When I pressed him for my release at the outbreak of war, he told me that the war would soon end. My repeated requests during the Western campaign were refused with the observation that he, Hitler, would be the one to decide how long I remained his adjutant. He did not like new faces, so flying had to be my consolation, and I took every opportunity to try out every German aircraft from the Fieseler Storch to the Me 268. To the last, Hitler wanted me at his side. While convalescing from my injuries in the autumn of 1944, I became inwardly estranged from him. I realized that the mutual relationship of trust that had developed between us had blinded me to the black side of his regime. I saw that he alone prevented the end to a struggle which had become pointless. I hope that my reminiscences will contribute in some way to a further understanding of that chain of events which changed the world so decisively following the outbreak of war in 1914, and to which I was for a few years a witness. I had never wanted to be anything other than a soldier. Towards the end of my secondary education, I applied to join Infantry Regiment No. 12, Halberstadt, as an officer cadet. I was rejected on account of slight myopia. My uncle Otto von Below, former General der Infanterie, and CNC 14 Schar 17th Army, pulled a few strings, and at last I was accepted in April 1928. My early career took an unusual turn. Following certain psychotechnical tests prior to induction into Wehrkreiskommando 6th Münster, and even before recruit training, I was sent with 20 other cadets to the German commercial flying school at Schleißheim. My joy and pride can be imagined. I suppose I must have displayed a talent for flying, for I was one of the 10 cadets of the group sent for training as fighter pilots to Lipetsk near Voronezh in the Soviet Union between May and September 1929. We rose at 5 every morning, and although we wore civilian clothes, there was no mistaking the military character of the establishment. We seldom had contact with Russian civilians or airmen. I served with Infantry Regiment 12 from 1st October 1929 until the spring of 1933. The only interruptions were tactical infantry training at Dresden, where I became acquainted with future generals such as List, Hube, and Rommel, and 2 flying courses of 4 weeks' duration at Rechlin, run by the future SS General Wilhelm Dietrich. I was promoted to lieutenant on 1st October 1932 and was transferred from the army into the disguised Luftwaffe on 1st July 1933. I spent a few unprofitable weeks training in Italy. The Italian instructors had no intention of being of any use whatever to us. I had learned more at Lipetsk. My first posting in Germany was to a small squadron at Starken Airfield near Berlin, where we flew as targets for the army. I learnt little new, but the nearness of the Reich capital was a compensation. In the autumn of 1934, I was appointed Staffelkapitän to the fighter squadron JG-132 Derberitz. My commanding officer was Major Ritter von Greim. After 6 months, I became adjutant to the fighter group under the future General von Düring. Our most prominent trainees were Kesselring and Wever, both of whom I got to know on the friendliest terms. On 20th February 1936, I went with 7 Staffel 3 JG 134 to Lippstadt to take part in the occupation of the demilitarized Rhineland. On 7th of March, we took off, circled Cologne, and landed at Düsseldorf-Lohausen, our new home airfield. On 15th June 1937, I was at the estate of my future in-laws at Nienhagen, near Halberstadt, when I received a telephone call ordering me to report next morning to the head of the Personnel Bureau at the Reich Air Ministry RLM, Oberst Ritter von Greim. I was given such precise instructions for my uniform dress and accoutrements that I knew I should be in the presence of Hitler. Hauptmann Mantius, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, had been killed in a flying accident a few weeks previously, and I detected a possible connection. Next morning, I left very early for Berlin and reported to Oberst von Greim punctually at 9. He told me I had to report to Goering at 10, when all would be revealed. Goering asked me a few questions before he came to the point. I was to be offered the position of Luftwaffe adjutant to Hitler. Would I be prepared to accept it? If I could not be Hitler's follower, heart and soul, then I should say so at once. I should have to serve the Führer from innermost conviction. The reason for this, I discovered later. Greim and the chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff had recommended me to Goering, who knew of my scepticism concerning National Socialism. I agreed. In 1934, I had taken the oath of unconditional loyalty and obedience to Adolf Hitler, and I could not see how this appointment could require me to go beyond that. The post would be held for 2 years. I was subordinated entirely to Hitler. My duties, insofar as they affected the Luftwaffe High Command, could be discussed with Goering's personal adjutant, Oberst Bodenschatz, but he would not interfere in my sphere of duty. I should report to the Wehrmacht Adjutantur in the Reich Chancellery at 1 that afternoon. He, Goering, would be with the Führer and introduce me personally. The first person I met in the Adjutantur was the naval adjutant, Korvettenkapitän Karl Jesko von Puttkamer. My first impression was of a tall, blonde, good-looking and taciturn cigar smoker. He escorted me through a very long corridor to the Führer's residence. Our duty rooms were in the former Vossisch Palace, which stood on the corner of Vossstrasse and the Wilhelmsplatz, and was a massive edifice dating from the time of the founder. The adjacent Brüning Chancellery was built in 1930. Hitler had added a balcony to its simple limestone facade. A basement corridor connected the Vossisch Palace through the Brüning building to the old Reich Chancellery, which was known as the Führer residence, because Hitler lived there. This attractive 18th century edifice, in the form of a square open on one side to the Wilhelmstrasse, had been purchased in 1871 as the official residence for Bismarck and used ever since by all Reich Chancellors. An entrance hall led into the Great Hall of the palace at its centre. After I had been introduced to the party, SA and SS men who crowded there, shouts from the street of Sieg Heil, the calling out of the guard, shouted orders, rifles being presented in salute, the sound of a cart drawing up to the entrance and the heel clicking of the SS guard heralded the arrival of Goering. Everybody gave him the Hitler salute, and he responded jovially to all sides. He would rarely offer his hand except to a Reich minister or high party functionary. I was told to wait, and shortly a manservant arrived and bade me follow him. I passed through 2 clumsy-looking double-winged doors set at a right angle, and on entering the so-called small saloon, saw Hitler and a standing Goering together on the far side. I saluted and was about to recite the usual form of military introduction when Goering interrupted and presented me to Hitler. Without formality or military stiffness, Hitler offered me his hand in greeting. After Goering had departed, lunch was taken. One passed through the smoking room, the name being a legacy from Bismarck's time, into the dining room, which was a large, almost square, well-proportioned room decorated in tasteful light colours. At its centre was a large round table with 12 chairs. 4 smaller round tables, each with 6 chairs, were positioned round about. Hitler sat at the large table with his back to the window. On the opposite wall, above a long sideboard, hung Kaulbach's painting, The Entry of the Sun Goddess. I sat at one of the peripheral tables and noticed how Hitler would often glance at me as if to etch my features into his memory. This was a habit I observed of him frequently. Table conversation was free. The first days in my new role were not happy. I knew nobody. The Army and Luftwaffe adjutants were distant and unfriendly. I was sceptical about the NSDAP, but came constantly into contact with party people. Bodenschatz, Goering's personal ADC, was a great comfort. He knew how to steer clear of court intrigues and would withdraw into no man's land, a remote office with no telephone, when trouble brewed. My first day as Hitler's Luftwaffe ADC was 23rd June 1937. My duty was to remain in readiness at the Führer residence to act as liaison between Hitler and the Luftwaffe High Command during the hours when Hitler was acting officially. At all other times, he was attended by his personal aides. Nevertheless, when I heard that same evening that the Milan Scala was performing La Bohème at Charlottenberg, I hinted to Hitler's chief ADC, SA Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Brückner, that I would not refuse an invitation, and he agreed at once, since he had been looking for somebody to accompany Hitler. Puttkamer and Hossbach always found some way to avoid listening to music, and Hitler expressed surprise that a military officer in his entourage had such an interest. He asked if I knew La Bohème, and seemed astonished that I had heard it in Hanover, Dresden, and Berlin. I had not suspected until then Hitler's close affinity to music. On that evening he was full of Bayreuth, Wagner, and Dietrich Eckart, the folk writer to whom he had dedicated Mein Kampf. During the Bayreuth festival itself, Hitler always stayed with Winifred Wagner, the daughter-in-law of the composer. In her house he was at home, the private man. I felt how he transferred his energies to his surroundings, his cheerfulness, his affection, his humour. With no other family did I observe this deep feeling of kinship, nor hear him speak in the familiar grammatical form which otherwise he used so sparingly. The Wagner home and music were his refuge. On 27th of July, Hitler invited us to be his guests at Bayreuth. From the Prince's Gallery, his large private box, we watched Siegfried and Götterdämmerung. After supper, Brückner took my wife by the arm and presented her to Frau Wagner and Hitler, who kissed her hand. From then on, we belonged to his private circle. Our daily timetable had to accord with Hitler's routine. He was very easy to get on with, being amiable and correct towards his staff. In Berlin, I would spend about an hour a day taking applications before joining the other adjutants at midday in our Reich Chancellery office. Hitler would not normally appear earlier from his private quarters. Because of his insomnia, Hitler worked into the early hours, when he found the quietness he needed for reflection. We would start with a mutual question and answer session to clarify outstanding matters. He would then keep his pre-lunch appointments, which were scheduled to finish by 2 p.m. If he overran, the meal would be delayed. Table conversation could be very interesting or extremely tedious, depending on how many times one had been over the subject before. Further appointments followed after lunch. If this involved Hitler meeting with a Luftwaffe officer, I would have to be on hand, but otherwise my duties were finished until Hitler reappeared that evening. During the afternoon he would retire to his private rooms to read or rest, although in good weather he enjoyed a walk in the Reich Chancellery Park. With the exception of the most urgent business, during the day he never used a desk except to sit on it. It was his rather odd custom to burst into a sudden dictation, and his adjutants would have to scribble down instructions and intentions and later practically recast them. These would be sudden inspirations and incomplete ideas. Errors in taking down the notes could have serious consequences, and so many of his intentions were misrepresented that an official reading a draft would draw attention to a doubtful assertion with the observation, "Does the Führer know that?" This story filtered throughout the Reich, so that eventually any statement which caused a raised eyebrow would be greeted by this catchphrase in response. A serious weakness of the whole system of dictatorial government in Germany was that nobody was able to say with any certainty what Hitler had really meant when he dictated something at speed and his original idea had passed through several pairs of hands. The evening meal was normally taken at 8 p.m. with a smaller circle. Speer or Heinrich Hoffmann, Bauer his pilot, 1 or 2 military adjutants and one of the medical officers would be there, and his personal ADCs would look round to make up the numbers with guests who enjoyed Hitler's conversation. During dinner, a list of the newest films, including foreign releases, would be presented by Goebbels, and Hitler's choice would be shown afterwards in the orchestral room. Hitler's house servants, his SS guards and guest chauffeurs were all invited. After the film, he would sit before the fireplace with his guests and staff. Drinks from tea to champagne would be served, and cakes and sandwiches if the evening looked like being a long one. The evening conversation rarely tailed off much before 2 the next morning. Hitler's female secretaries ate at table and joined in the social evening at the Berghof, and later at Führer HQs, but not at the Reich Chancellery. There were 4 personal adjutants with high SA or SS ranks. Wilhelm Bruckner was chief ADC. He was ever helpful and a friendly advisor. As our wives got along well, we had an excellent private relationship. Both Bruckner and Julius Schaub had been in prison with Hitler at Landsberg. Fritz Wiedemann had been Hitler's superior office in the Great War. I had no contact with him. The 4th personal ADC was Albert Bormann, younger brother of Martin Bormann. On account of a personal feud, they never spoke. There were additionally 4 female secretaries, 3 to 5 personal manservants, one of whom during the day had always to be within call. The housekeeper Kannenberg, Hans Bauer, Hitler's pilot, Erich Kempker, his chauffeur, Gescher and Schadler, commanders of the Begleitkommando, the heads of the plainclothes police detachments, Rattenhuber and Högel, and 4 physicians, Brandt, von Hasselbach, Haase, and Morell. An important role was played by the unusually popular SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, who, as commander of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and chief of the Begleitkommando, was responsible for Hitler's personal safety. 2 others must be mentioned not belonging to Hitler's personal staff, but always close to him: Press Officer Reichsleiter Dr. Dietrich and Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. Until 1941, Bormann was party chief and liaison man between Hitler and Hess. Later, as Hitler's secretary, he became involved in matters of policy. This circle, including the military adjutants, was Hitler's personal retinue. Each went with him from place to place. Regular duty could be as much as 16 hours daily, but despite this, there was no increase in staff size from first to last. Despite their differing social origins, the staff worked well together and without friction. The danger lay therein that each was subordinated to Hitler directly and felt answerable to him alone. The Führer standard at the flagstaff on the Chancellery roof and a lively coming and going of visitors were the hallmarks of Hitler's presence. The lower rooms of the Führer residence had been furbished by Speer and Troost, and a successful blend of chambers and home had been achieved. The hall faced the courtyard, behind large central doors permanently shut, and facing the garden was the small saloon, which connected the large orchestral room and the smoking room. The orchestral room had a door into the hall. This room was where Hitler received visitors and officials, and occasionally relatives and friends. These were mostly tea invitations and rarely lasted an hour. Hitler's table guests assembled in the smoking room before the meal. From the smoking room one passed into the dining room, beyond which was the Winter Garden and the banqueting hall. The Winter Garden was a room about 30 metres long and 10 wide with a long window overlooking the garden, and was preferred by Hitler during the day. A wide carpet ran from the dining room door to the garden entrance at the far end of the Winter Garden, and Hitler was fond of strolling the length of this carpet immersed in conversation. At first, this was with Goering, Goebbels and Hess, and often for up to 3 hours at a time. As military problems began to increase, it became more common for the military adjutants to accompany him. The Führer's private suite, consisting of library, sitting room, bedroom and washroom, were located on the first floor. A small room was reserved for Eva Braun. Beyond these were the servants' quarters. The upper landing led to a side wing accommodating the typing and overnight rooms for the secretaries. 3 floors down were the rooms for the adjutants, press officer and Sepp Dietrich. These latter were the innermost circle who had to be on hand at short notice day and night. On the other side of the upper landing was a small dining room used by Hitler for access to the Congress Hall in the central part of the building when in use for military conferences during the war. It was at the old Reich Chancellery that I was destined to spend the greater part of my service life in the Third Reich. Other time was spent at the various Führer HQs, at the Berghof, Hitler's retreat on the Obersalzberg mountain near the town of Berchtesgaden, and at the new Reich Chancellery, which was opened officially in January 1939. The Führer's special train often served as his HQ during manoeuvres and operations. Hitler was very keen on living in his train. Weather permitting, he would often alight with his staff and take a walk. The train was not luxurious but practical. Outwardly, it consisted of 2 locomotives pulling 8 coaches of uniform shape and dark green colour. The first was a machinery and luggage coach. Next came Hitler's car with a long table and 8 chairs forward. A corridor led to several compartments, 2 for Hitler, 1 each for his 2 senior adjutants, 1 for his 2 manservants, and 3 for domestic purposes. The third coach was for SS and police. The 4th was the dining car, the 5th and 6th were for guests, adjutants, physicians and secretaries. The 7th was for the press, and the 8th was the rear machinery coach. All persons had to be in possession of a valid Reichsbahn first-class ticket for the journey. We of the retinue had an annual season ticket, but it was the job of the personal ADCs to obtain tickets and distribute them to the guests before the train set off. On 19th September 1937, I was in company with Hitler on manoeuvres. I watched a number of generals making their reports to him, and remember how Manstein and Halder both avoided giving details since they thought that Hitler had no grasp of strategy or tactics. This amused me. On the last day of the manoeuvres, the Luftwaffe displayed the use of heavy and light flak guns against ground targets at the Wystrel flak firing range on the Baltic coast. The use of 8.8 cm as flak against tanks brought strong comments from some army officers, who saw this as the Luftwaffe meddling in army business. Visiting an 8.8 cm Luftwaffe flak battery, Hitler inspected the guns and fire control, then drew me into conversation. It was general talk, the grouping of flak units into batteries according to caliber size and such like, but this was not a layman speaking, and he showed appreciation of operational use. He could also recite important technical data, but wanted to know the rate of fire for the weapons. I had no idea and was about to summon the battery commander when he told me not to bother, and we walked on. I told him that as a fighter pilot, I knew next to nothing about flak. Hitler then spoke of flak as being of greater importance for air defence than fighters. I argued with him the importance of the fighter arm, but he replied that the main task of the Luftwaffe was ground attack and therefore bombers. In October 1937, Jeschonnek told me that the Luftwaffe was forced to plan its building programme to suit the raw material allotment. Flak and the construction of air raid bunkers came a poor second with Goering after aircraft production, contrary to Hitler's order that the same degree of urgency applied to each. Goering was always trying to convince Hitler that the fighter arm was the best defense against enemy air attack. Hitler would not accept this. When the fighter defense was found, wanting from 1943 onwards, Hitler bitterly criticized Goering in the light of his 1938 instruction. He had foreseen what the experts considered impossible. On 22 November 1937, Hitler visited the Messerschmitt factory at Augsburg to mark the spectacular success of the Bf 109 in breaking the world record with a speed of 610.95 pi. Milch and Udet headed a delegation of officers and engineers from the Reich Air Ministry Technical Office. There was ill feeling between Milch and Messerschmitt, which had originated from the time Milch had been general director at Lufthansa. This discord had soured the relationship between Messerschmitt and the RLM, with the result that Germany's best aircraft designer was not put to the best use. While Hitler was touring the works, Messerschmitt approached him in one of the work halls and, signalling for two great hangar doors to be opened, revealed the mock-up of a four-engined aircraft. At this, the RLM gentleman became very uneasy, and the horror on Milch's face was evident. Hitler listened very attentively to Messerschmitt's description of the aircraft's capabilities. It was a projected four-engined long-range bomber, a forerunner to the Me-264, later built but not series produced. Messerschmitt said it had a range of 6,000 km with a 1-ton bomb load at 600 kph. The RLM people expressed doubt at these figures. Hitler was non-committal. He was less well read about aircraft than about ships, panzers or guns. He said, however, that it must be possible to build a bomber which could outfly a fighter. If a fighter could manage 600 kph, then a bomber needed 650 TAV. This would mean that armour and weapons on such a fast bomber would be sacrificed for speed. Milch said that a contract with these specifications had been placed some time ago. Messerschmitt interjected that the speed was not possible at all at present because the necessary engine had not been developed. Hitler said it was right that the four-engine bomber should have priority. Milch replied that the Luftwaffe was subject to limits on raw materials, and he considered that a two-engined fast bomber was preferable. The discussion then broke up. Over the next few weeks, I tried to get to the bottom of all this intrigue. I found that, at General Staff, Jeschonek was the coming man. I had got on well with him from the start, and I used him subsequently as my contact at Luftwaffe High Command. Jeschonek talked to me about bomber planning. Hitler's insistence on a fast bomber was not new. Weber, first chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, had demanded it. However, the Luftwaffe had awarded to Junkers Dessau and others the building contract for a twin-engine bomber, with the specification that as far as possible armament and equipment was secondary to speed. This aircraft, the Ju-88, had achieved 500 kph on trials. To my objection that fighters could do 100 kph more, Jeschonek said that the existing record had been achieved with a souped-up engine. The Me-109 series model would come off the production line with a standard engine, weapons and radio installation, and fly no faster than 500 kph. The next Ju-88 variant would have more powerful motors. These would be ready in about a year. Jeschonek believed that the Ju-88 was the ideal bomber for the Luftwaffe. If a long-range bomber were needed, why, another variant of the Ju-88 would fit the bill here. Goering had now abandoned the four-engine series ordered by Weber. The first of these designs, the Ju-89 and the Du-19, had flown but were either to be scrapped or put to other uses. The Ju-89 became the Ju-90 commercial airliner. Goering had decided in favour of the Ju-88 on account of the raw materials situation. For one four-engine bomber, two twin-engine aircraft could be built, and this looked good in the production figures. I asked who had instigated and authorised this decision. Jeschonek could not answer. He said he must have been at Greifswald at the time. He was convinced that the Augsburg Me-264 would never get off the ground. The fatal decision had already been taken not to provide the Luftwaffe with a long-range four-engined bomber. Goering's decision in 1938 to erect an air defence zone, LVZ, along the western frontier arose because the army did not want the West Wall or Siegfried Line, and Goering saw the opportunity to put himself in Hitler's good books. The LVZ was a second line of defence behind the West Wall along the entire western frontier. Many 8.8cm flak guns were planned in the emplacements for a dual flak anti-tank role. The army expressed annoyance at this interference in its business. In mid-May 1939, Hitler inspected the West Wall, accompanied by a large entourage and huge press following. General Lieutenant Kitchener earned special praise from Hitler for the skillful installation of the flak batteries. All who saw it were very impressed by the great achievement of construction in so short a time. Even though only 2/3 complete, the fortifications were easily a match for any French artillery and tanks of the time. In autumn 1938, Goering could not imagine that there could ever be an air force superior to the Luftwaffe. Even war itself seemed beyond the bounds of probability. He had taken seriously Hitler's instruction to increase fivefold the Luftwaffe's strength. I asked Jeschonnek how long this would take. He said 2 years. Fuel and pilot training were the main problems, but Jeschonnek rubber-stamped the aircraft building program. The Ju-88 would become the standard bomber. According to Uda, the He-177 was a very promising successor. Goering wanted to award Junkers the contract to mass-produce the Ju-88, but Jeschonnek knew, as did the technical experts, that many teething problems remained to be overcome. Koppenberg, General Director of Junkers, had promised that nothing would stand in the way. Goering, Udate, and Jeschonnek had the fullest confidence in him. Only Milch had doubts. The He-177 was still a doubtful proposition, particularly the innovation of 2 pairs of engines in tandem. The prototype would fly in the summer of 1939, and series production was supposed to commence before the end of 1940. I had the impression that Jeschonnek was putting the case in such a way that there seemed no doubt about the viability of the whole Luftwaffe program. It was obvious to me, however, that only the fighter program with the proven Me-109 was definite. The Ju-88 and the He-177 projects seemed questionable, and I did not conceal from Jeschonnek that I would put the situation to Hitler exactly as I saw it. Even the General Staff preliminary planning and the England war games had highlighted our basic weaknesses. In principle, we had no bomber able to make a long flight over the open sea, or for any penetration cross-country, with a reasonable bomb load. I put it to Jeschonnek that Goering should be influenced to put the state of the Luftwaffe plainly to Hitler. If nothing else, this made clear to him Hitler's growing interest in Luftwaffe questions. It had become Hitler's custom to ask me for details about squadrons, flak batteries, bomb and munition stocks and weapons. I had a notebook packed with this sort of information. Hitler knew this, and one day he asked me, "Have you got your clever little book with you?" He wanted some detail or other. One did not have to have all the facts and figures, but it was important that what one did have was accurate. I found out that eventually he placed more reliance on the details in my notebook than on what Goering supplied him from memory. On 19th November 1938, I had a chance to speak privately with Hitler. I was concerned that he was basing his plans on false information. As I suspected, he was under the impression that the Ju-88 was proven and ready for operations. He accepted my contradiction in silence. As for the He-197, he showed his instinct for simple technical solutions and expressed doubts about the arrangement of engines in tandem for a 4-engined aircraft. Goering had told his people at RLM that Hitler was not competent to speak on the subject. I came to the view gradually that Goering was deliberately circulating a false assertion about Hitler's technical understanding and knowledge. At the time, Hitler trusted Goering implicitly and was happy to leave Luftwaffe details in his hands. But as time went on, Hitler took more interest in the Luftwaffe than Goering suspected. Just before Christmas 1938, my wife and I attended the Paris International Aircraft Exhibition, where amongst others the British Spitfire was on display and attracted a great deal of interest. It was in an unfinished state, so we gained only an outward impression. It resembled the Me-109. As I knew the flying qualities of the latter, I could see that the Spitfire would probably be equal. No engine was fitted, but we heard rumours. Hitler listened attentively to my report. I stated frankly that we had to reckon with the British fighter being superior because the British built better engines. In the end, it probably came down to the design. Hitler decided that he had no time to lose. At RLM, I explained my impressions to Jeschonnek and their effect on Hitler. Göring was not interested in my report. I assumed he knew everything worth knowing from Udet. Later, I discovered that he knew nothing. For the first time, I became aware of Göring's peculiarity of underestimating foreign developments. According to him, no nation in the world could overtake Germany's armaments potential. One could not contradict him for fear of being labelled defeatist. Hitler, sceptical and curious by nature, was different. He was especially interested in foreign weapons and armaments capacity. He scoured overseas technical journals avidly and had all foreign texts of interest translated. His eye had been trained by architecture and painting. Many ill-informed technical experts suffered embarrassment at his hands. Following the political developments in February 1939, Jeschonnek had begun to think in terms of war with Britain. Göring had told him frequently that Hitler did not want war with Britain, as I could confirm, but Jeschonnek always replied, "The devil is a squirrel." What he had considered impossible in 1938, he now made the foundation stone of his deliberations. The absence of a long-range bomber worried him very much. The Ju-88 was running up against many difficulties. He complained that Göring did not recognise the significance of technology. Since Weber's death in 1936, it had been neglected in the Luftwaffe. On the morning of 3rd July 1939, at Rechlin, Göring, Milch, Udet and Jeschonnek, accompanied by a large staff of engineers and technical officers, met Hitler for an air display. This had been instigated by Milch, who was concerned that the Luftwaffe production programme could not be met because of the shortage of raw materials. Whilst Milch always tried to give an honest picture of the situation, Göring tailored his reports to make it seem that everything was proceeding without a hitch. At Rechlin, where Udet was in charge, Göring and Udet had got their heads together and agreed to divert Hitler's attention to other matters. Göring, who was himself baffled easily by science, gave his associates to understand that Hitler knew nothing about aircraft, but was very interested in weapons. The purpose of this was to ensure that discussions about squadron problems could be avoided. The airshow made a lasting impression on spectators. Milch managed to make Hitler aware that everything he was seeing was in the experimental stage, but nobody told him that after the successful conclusion of all tests, it would be 2 to 3 years before the squadrons got the aircraft. As soon as Hitler showed interest in something, or thought such and such a development was important, Göring gave him a promise to ensure its delivery to the forces as soon as possible. Undoubtedly, the most impressive display was the maiden flight of the He-176, the world's first rocket-powered aircraft. Although it was only in the air a few minutes, the aircraft reached a speed of L-1000 kph, a phenomenal achievement for the time. The He-100 seemed superior to the Me-109, but Göring and Udet had already decided in favour of the latter, leaving Heinkel to specialise in bombers. An overladen He-111 was seen taking off with the assistance of 2 rockets. In order to carry out its task as the standard bomber, it usually flew overloaded, either with additional fuel tanks for longer range, or with more bombs for greater effect. Relying on Hitler's assurances, Göring, Milch and Udet were not expecting war until 1943. The show was planned with this in mind. Nevertheless, on the return journey, I reminded Hitler that what he had seen was music for the distant future. I suggested that he should invite Luftwaffe technical experts, especially Milch, to an armaments conference. He was very much in favour. However, because of political developments, it never took place, and the Rechlin show made a false impression on Hitler. The bottleneck was caused by the lack of raw materials. This was never discussed. It was unforgivable that Goering and his close associates never drew the necessary conclusions. The successful campaigns of 1939 and 1940 cast a dark shadow over the realities. 2 years on, after the first crisis of the Russian campaign, the fatal errors were recognised at last. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles had ceded the German city of Danzig to Poland. The province of East Prussia was an enclave to which access from the Reich could only be guaranteed by sea. Hitler proposed that Danzig be returned to Germany, and that an ex-territorial land or rail link be established across Poland to link the Reich and East Prussia. In Germany, this corridor question was much discussed, and even opposition circles sympathised with it. Certainly there was more understanding than there had been for the Czech question. There was in existence a non-aggression pact between Germany and Poland, the 5th anniversary of which fell on 6th of January 1939. The day previously, Ribbentrop opened talks on the questions with Polish Foreign Minister Beck at Obersalzberg. At the end of January, Ribbentrop returned from the reciprocal meeting in Warsaw empty-handed. At the end of March, after the resolution of the Czech and Memel problems, Ribbentrop had comprehensive talks with the Polish ambassador Lipski. The latter was shocked at recent events and travelled reluctantly to Warsaw with Ribbentrop's fresh approach. The next we heard was reports from London that the Poles had requested a closer relationship with Britain. On the 30th of March, when British Prime Minister Chamberlain spoke on the subject in the Commons, Poland delivered a brusque rejection of Germany's request for more talks. Hitler concluded that the Poles would only adopt such a stance if they had the written backing of the British. On 11th April, in the instruction for the Unified Wehrmacht Preparations for War, 1939-1940, there occurred the first mention of Fall Weiss, Case White, the cover name for military operations against Poland. A provocative and undiplomatic letter from Roosevelt, published in Washington before its arrival in Germany, demanded Hitler's assurance that he would not attack about 30 named European nations and suggested negotiations about disarmament. This was a sore point with Hitler, for the disarmament question had been the strongest argument in his political battle to revise the Versailles Treaty. For him, the League of Nations was an institution formed by the victor states of World War I to supervise the disarmament of Germany. The victor states, notably Britain and France, had not disarmed but actually rearmed. It seemed to him that the Western democracies wanted Germany to remain a pariah forever. He denigrated Roosevelt's lying polities, which on the one hand condemned totalitarianism and on the other sought closer ties with the USSR. Hitler's Reichstag speech of 28th April, generally considered one of his best ever, gave Roosevelt his answer in 21 points and reaped storming applause. As to the reality of foreign policy, Hitler declared that, by their recent negotiations with Britain, the Poles had acted in breach of the 1934 German-Polish Treaty, which they had accordingly abrogated. In a conversation with his military advisers at the end of May, Hitler stated that Poland would always side with our enemies, whilst Britain was the driving force against Germany. In order to isolate Poland and hold off the British, it was decided in June to investigate the possibility of an accommodation with the USSR. Favourable signals had been received from Moscow some time previously. Preparations to invade Poland were initiated in July, but to disguise his intentions, Hitler kept to his normal social programme and attended the Bayreuth Festival that month as usual. On 12th of August 1939, Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to move up to the Polish border and set Saturday 26th August as X-Day. At that time, reports of Polish excesses against the German minorities in the former Reich provinces of West Prussia and Upper Silesia were appearing in the press almost daily. They were confirmed by our embassies in Warsaw and German consulates elsewhere in Poland. As these advices were sober and devoid of propaganda, the situation was obviously alarming. Hitler spoke frequently to his private circle about the untenable conditions and the stream of refugees which, according to the registration authorities, already exceeded 70,000. There was no possibility that the NSDAP foreign organization had worked as agent provocateur as in Austria and the Sudetenland, for Germans were being subjected to something which resembled a reign of terror, irrespective of their politics or religion. To Hitler, this implied Poland's readiness to fight. It could only be understood in terms of Polish chauvinism, for Poland was isolated. On 19 August, the Russo-German Economic Treaty was signed. As it was appearing more likely that Britain would consider a German invasion of Poland as a cause for war, Ribbentrop convinced Hitler that a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union would be the last chance to forestall British intervention, and returned to Moscow for that purpose on 23 August. At midday on 22 August, in the Berghof, Hitler addressed senior Wehrmacht commanders. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, using a prompt of handwritten headings. His primary purpose was to win the confidence of the generals for his decision to invade Poland. In the first part of his speech, he explained his judgment of the factors likely to determine the response of the individual European nations. Immediately before the midday break, he announced Ribbentrop's mission to Moscow. The astonishment and relief were almost tangible. The pact was received favourably by those officers who in the Reichswehr period had worked in cooperation with the Red Army. I knew that several generals were opposed to Hitler and his policy of war, but although Hitler had glossed over certain matters, such as the influence of the USA on various European states, there were no questions. The pact with the USSR had left the skeptics speechless. Before lunch, on 23 August, Hitler received British Ambassador Henderson with a letter from Prime Minister Chamberlain. A reply was dictated after a long discussion and handed to Henderson. This talk seemed to have incensed Hitler. He accused the British government of having handed Poland a blank cheque in April to resist his moderated demands in respect of Danzig and the Polish corridor. Since then, the outcry against Volksdeutsche in Poland had increased steadily. The Poles would never have done that without the encouragement of Britain. The British preferred another war against Germany to a revision of the Versailles Treaty, whilst he, Hitler, had done nothing to harm Britain's interests. On the Obersalzberg, a gloriously warm summer's day was drawing to a close. The terrace doors were wide open, and Hitler spent his time in company in the open. During this waiting period, he drew me into conversation while we walked the terrace. This encounter with him has remained one of the most memorable for me because of an unusual celestial phenomenon. Hitler had posed a general question about the strength and armament of the Polish Air Force, and if it would be in a position to bomb Berlin. It was no more than 150 kilometers from the Polish border to the Reich capital, but I told him it was out of the question that a Polish bomber force would be able to fly an offensive against German cities following the surprise attack. As we strolled up and down, the eerie turquoise-coloured sky to the north turned first violet and then blood red. At first we thought there must be a serious fire behind the Untersberg mountain, but then the glow covered the whole northern sky in the manner of the Northern Lights. Such an occurrence is exceptionally rare in southern Germany. I was very moved and told Hitler that it augured a bloody war. He responded that if it must be so, then the sooner the better. The more time went by, the bloodier it would be. I recounted this conversation to Speer in 1967, but later he attributed my remark erroneously to Hitler in his book Erinnerungen. Shortly afterwards, Ribbentrop telephoned Hitler with the information that Stalin wanted the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia. Hitler threw a cursory glance at the map provided for him and authorized Ribbentrop to concede them. At about 2 o'clock next morning, Ribbentrop advised that the treaty was signed. Hitler congratulated him and remarked to us, "That will explode in their faces." The public in Germany and worldwide reacted with surprise, astonishment, dismay, disbelief and condemnation. On 24th August, only 36 hours separated us from war. After the talk the previous day, Hitler was not sure that Britain would remain neutral, even though Henderson knew about Ribbentrop's mission and implied that the British government was impressed. So the mood that evening tended to be pessimistic. Hitler saw the coming military campaign against Poland, of the success of which he was absolutely convinced, as the only way out of the political cul-de-sac. On the morning of 25th August, I consulted the Luftwaffe General Staff about the mobilization preparations, operational squadrons and objectives before joining talks at the Führer HQ Adjutanter regarding our arrangements for the coming days. Hitler had finally advised Mussolini of tomorrow's invasion of Poland. Several times previously, the Italians had expressed their annoyance that Hitler always notified his allies of events post-festum, but Hitler preferred their resentment to the greater evil of risking their loquacity. The previous evening, Chamberlain and Foreign Minister Lord Halifax had made parliamentary speeches which had led to accusations in the British newspapers that Hitler wanted to conquer the world. At lunchtime, Hitler summoned the British ambassador to protest and declared his wish to resolve the German-Polish question. After this, he would be ready for an extensive accommodation with Britain. Late on the afternoon of 25th August, Britain announced ratification of the Anglo-Polish Mutual Assistance Treaty of 6th of April, and Italian Foreign Minister Attolico delivered Mussolini's note stating that Italy was not prepared for war. Ribbentrop immediately suggested to Hitler that the attack order be withdrawn to consider the implications. Keitel was sent for, and Hitler ordered him to stop the invasion. Hitler had been dealt a low blow. His plan had been overturned by a combination of factors beyond his control. When he appeared next morning, he had already read the foreign news reports. Now he saw a close connection between the two events of the previous day. Mussolini's stance must have been engineered by London, where his ambassador there, Count Grandi, although a member of the fascist Grand Council in Rome, was a dyed-in-the-wool Anglophile monarchist. Harsh words followed, although Mussolini's loyalty was not questioned. Hitler attributed guilt to monarchist circles within the Italian army and diplomatic corps, whose anti-German and pro-British threads intertwined at court. Yet, even in Reich Chancellery chambers, Ribbentrop's staff spoke out for the Italian policy in the hope of dissuading Hitler from war. On the evening of 28th August, the British ambassador delivered a memorandum implying that Poland was prepared to enter into direct talks with Germany. Hitler accepted the proposal on the 29th and requested that a Polish plenipotentiary be sent to Berlin the next day. Henderson interpreted this deadline as an ultimatum and became so excited that Ribbentrop had to intervene to calm him down. Accordingly, Hitler remained prepared for bilateral discussions with Poland, provided that Britain did not take part. The short deadline had a purely military basis. Hitler had been advised by his generals not to delay X-Day beyond 6th September because of the weather situation, the precondition for rapid operations being the use of the Luftwaffe. This gave Hitler only 4 days, and for this reason the Polish negotiator had to come at once. The last exchange of notes with Britain seemed to clear the way for negotiations with Poland. Hitler emphasised that the only matters in dispute were Danzig, the Polish corridor, and the treatment of the German minority. In the Führer residence, our impression that the danger of war was past was reinforced when the Reichstag deputies, recalled to Berlin on 26th of August, were sent home next day after hearing a short speech in the Chancellery in which Hitler stressed his heartfelt wish to solve the Polish question without bloodshed. He had, however, stated his readiness to fight if Britain continued to oppose the right of the German people to revise the Versailles Treaty. On 30th August, Ribbentrop and Goering came several times to the Chancellery to help formulate the proposals for the Polish emissary. Hitler himself dictated the memorandum, which tabled 16 points. I thought that these were not excessive. The city of Danzig would return to the Reich. The proposal for a referendum in the Polish corridor was new. Depending on its outcome, Hitler suggested an ex-territorial road and rail link between the Reich and East Prussia. Hitler was very doubtful that a Polish negotiator would come, and he was right. Instead of sending a plenipotentiary, Poland mobilized. Hitler sent for Brauchitsch and Keitel that afternoon, and set X hour for 0445 on Friday 3rd September. Just before midnight on 30 August, Henderson called on Ribbentrop with a fresh memorandum and a verbal explanation. The British government had not been able to recommend that Poland send a plenipotentiary to Berlin, but suggested instead that Ribbentrop should summon Lipski, the Polish ambassador, and give him the 16 points in order to set up talks. Ribbentrop declined. By the early hours of 31st August, Hitler seemed to have made his decision. Initially impassive, he now broke into a tirade against Britain. The ratification of the Anglo-Polish Treaty on 25 August was proof that Britain was engineering war in Europe. He doubted the assertion in the British memorandum of the 28th that London possessed the Polish government's promise of willingness to negotiate with the German government. That no plenipotentiary came on the 30th proved the lie. Britain's motive was delay because the Poles had no intention of entering talks. As if to prove the point, Lipski called on Ribbentrop just after 6 in the evening of the 31st of August and said that the previous evening Britain had told his government about the possibility of direct talks between Germany and Poland. Warsaw would supply London with an answer within a few hours. When this report reached Hitler, he reacted angrily. 2 days ago, he had delivered to Henderson an offer of direct talks with a Polish plenipotentiary, and this was the first the Poles had heard of it. Their behaviour was further proof that they wanted war. For these reasons, Hitler considered it pointless to continue negotiations. British diplomacy bore the same hallmarks as in 1914, when all British notes had the single purpose of absolving London from blame in the event of war. There now followed an unforgettable scene. Hitler stood in a circle of people, which included Ribbentrop and Goering. Goering said that he did not believe that the British would declare war. Hitler clapped him on the shoulder and replied, "My dear Goering, if the British ratify a treaty one day, they don't break it the next." Hitler believed that Britain would honour her pact with Poland. It was Britain's centuries-old political tradition that her schemes proceeded under a pretense of freedom and human rights. Hitler's offer to Poland had been honourable, for his mission was against the Soviets. All other struggles served only this single goal, to clear the way for war against Bolshevism. That must interest all Europe, and especially Britain, which had an empire at stake. On 31st August, in the Chancellery, field grey uniforms were more in evidence than previously. In a short conference with Brauchitsch and Keitel that morning, Hitler signed Instruction No. 1 for warfare. Diplomatic activity continued all day. From Italy came encouragement for a conference, as at Munich. That evening, German radio broadcast a summary of events of the preceding 3 days, including the 16-point proposal. The bulletin ended with the statement that the Polish government had failed to respond to Germany's loyal, fair and admissible demands. Whoever had ears should have known from that what it presaged for the morrow. In the early morning of 1st September 1939, there was broadcast to the Wehrmacht, the German people and the world, a proclamation by the Führer and Reich Chancellor that he had ordered the Wehrmacht to attack Poland. Next came Hitler's Reichstag speech, in which he wore for the first time the field grey tunic tailored for him without his knowledge by his SS aides. Previously, he had always worn a brown jacket with swastika armband. Now he wore the field grey tunic with SS eagle high on the left sleeve, a garment which, as he said in his Reichstag speech, he would not cast aside until after victory. The Reichstag gave Hitler a storming reception, the shouts of Heil being far more than usual, and spontaneous applause broke out continually during his speech. All negotiations by the German government against Versailles since 1919, and especially for the Polish corridor, were popular in Germany, but as the day wore on and it became clear that Hitler had set in train a full-scale war, the mood sobered, and the question of how Britain and France would react preoccupied everybody. Nevertheless, Hitler was greeted jubilantly on his journey to and from the Reichstag, and on the Wilhelmsplatz an enormous crowd had gathered. In the rooms of the Reich Chancellery, the flow of visitors and the disquiet grew steadily. The latest reports of the foreign press agencies were awaited avidly. All discussions centred on whether Britain would declare war. The party functionaries were sure that Britain was bluffing again, otherwise Hitler would not have invaded Poland. They had no idea that he knew that he risked war with Britain when he gave the order, in the depths of his being hoping against hope, that Britain would step back from the brink. The first reports from the front spoke of victories. These fortified Hitler against the warnings and threats uttered that day from London and Paris. In the evening of 1st of September, the British and French ambassadors each delivered a note in which their governments declared themselves ready to fulfill their treaty obligations to Poland in the event that German troops were not withdrawn from Polish territory. The situation was becoming ever clearer and more grave. September 2nd passed with reports of further military successes. Mussolini made the last attempt for a conference to end hostilities, but it was already too late. At 9 on the morning of 3rd of September, Henderson delivered to the Foreign Office an ultimatum stating that Britain would consider herself at war with Germany if, by 11 o'clock, the German government had not given a satisfactory undertaking to cease hostilities and withdraw its troops from Poland. A few hours later, the French ambassador handed in an ultimatum in similar terms. These were the declarations of war. Chief Interpreter Schmidt, a member of Ribbentrop's ministerial office, proceeded immediately to the Chancellery, where Hitler and Ribbentrop were strolling on the winter garden. They knew already that Henderson wanted to present a note, and Ribbentrop had absented himself from his office because he knew that it could only be the declaration of war. Contrary to the description in Schmidt's book, Statist of Diplomatischer Bühne, an extra on the diplomatic stage, Hitler and Ribbentrop were standing together when he handed them the note. Göring did not arrive until later. I watched the scene through the glass doors. I had the impression that both were more disappointed than surprised. Perplexed dismay descended on the waiting guests and weighed down on everybody. During the morning of that fateful 3rd of September, when there was no going back, I accompanied Hitler in the winter garden. Bitterly he gave free rein to his thoughts on Britain's short-sighted attitude. Pausing suddenly, he asked me if I had writing materials. A statement had to be written for the German people. Before I had time to suggest he summon a female secretary, he began, Parteigenossen und Parteigenossinnen, party members. I interrupted and asked if this proclamation was only intended for party members. He reflected for a moment and then said, Write an das deutsche Volk, to the German people. Then he dictated at speed. I had great difficulty in keeping up, as I could not take shorthand. He noticed this and paused occasionally so that I could scribble most of it down. Immediately afterwards, I dictated the result to a secretary and presented him with the rough draft. Standing at the table in the smoking room, he started correcting it at once. I watched over his shoulder. Heinrich Hoffmann photographed this scene, and I was not surprised when the picture, which was to cause me such grief post-war, appeared next day on the front page of the Völkische Beobachter